Hello there, Flip here, and since the Ocelot is about to be released, we are going to be closing out the Xilonen saga by making a full guide on her, going over her best artifacts, constellations, weapons, and teams, as well as how good she'll be in the meta, including a whole bunch of things I feel like a lot of other creators have missed out on. But before we do that, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk on various topics regarding Genshin's meta and I'll try to keep you updated. And with that, let's begin. Alright, let's get this over with quickly, as standard Xilonen's normal attacks don't do anything that special. The only interesting thing about them is that her plunge scales off of defense, which will be useful when talking about her DPS playstyle later. So let's move on to her skill, which as with all Natlan characters is the most important part of her kit. Xilonen will enter her Night Soul Blessing state, doing an initial tick of Geo damage, then infusing her normal attacks with Geo, and giving a starting Night Soul point count of 45. She will also generate 3 unactivated source samples that will correspond to the matching elements of your 3 other party members, assuming they are Pyro, Hydro, Electro, Cryo, or Geo. And this is important as when these samples are activated, nearby enemies' resistances will be reduced by up to 36%, based on the samples you have for 15 seconds. Keep in mind that samples will not stack, so even if you have multiple of the same element in your team, it will stay as only a 36% res shred. But again, your samples need to be activated first, in which the way to do that is through getting 90 Night Soul points. You start with 45, and the way you generate the rest is through her Ascension 1 talent, where if you have 2 samples that are not Geo, so basically if 2 party members on your team are Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo, doing a normal attack will generate 35 Night Soul points, meaning to activate your samples for the resistance shred, you just need to activate your skill and attack twice. But if you don't have at least 2 characters on your team that are of those elements, so on a mono Geo team for example, Xilonen's own personal damage will be increased instead, which is what further enables her DPS teams, which I'll discuss more later. This does limit her potential as a universal support, as one, she does absolutely nothing for Onimo or Dendro carries, but also for Geo carries like Ito who commonly use 2 other Geo characters, she will not shred resistances on these teams. So if you want to play Ito teams with her, you'll have to trade out your other Geo units for 2 characters of a swirlable element. Now to close out her kit, we have her Elemental Burst, which is a 60 cost. She will do an initial instance of Geo damage, and then the burst can have 2 different effects, depending on the same circumstances as her Ascension 1. If you have 2 swirlable elements on your team, she will heal your active character for the next 12 seconds, and it is actually very strong healing, allowing her to be your sole defensive option on teams if you want. But if you don't meet this element requirement, then she deals off-field Geo damage instead, which is again important for her DPS teams. To burst every rotation on her as a support, if she's the only Geo character on your team, you are looking at 180 to 200 energy recharge, and on double Geo teams it's about 120 to 140, and if she's on Favoni's then these requirements are reduced by 20%. Though all her burst enables as a support is healing, if you don't need the healing then you can just skip using her burst and it isn't a big deal. Oh yeah, she also has an Ascension 4 that acts as a Night Soul burst when she reaches max Night Soul points. Currently this is helpful for Mualani and making her burst hit harder, and will most likely have more applications in the future, and the latter half of her Ascension 4 is just for her DPS teams, giving a defense increase when paired with an Natlan teammate. For talent priorities, as a support you want to level up her skill first, hell you want to crown it to give the most resistance shred it can, and then from there level up her burst for extra healing, and her normal attacks don't need to be touched. Though as a DPS most of her scaling will come from her plunge talent, so prioritize leveling up her normals first, then her burst and skill are equal priority. Overall at a base she's just a very convenient debuffer with some defensive utility, which you can't go wrong with. People have been complaining about Verdescent setups for a while and how it doesn't work in multi-wave or against some enemies with innate elemental auras, and the Ocelot lady will always be able to reduce resistances so long as they're the ones in your team, which is very nice quality of life. Regarding her prospects as a damage dealer, she isn't anything game breaking or close to at all really, but still a viable playstyle for her assuming you have Shunyan to enable and buff her plunging, and as well I'll touch on it over the course of this guide. And with that, let's first start with her artifacts. I am not even going to waste your time. If you're using Xilonen as a support, the only artifact set worth considering on her is the scroll set and nothing else. She's a Natlan character and therefore will give the full benefits, enabling a 40% team-wide damage bonus to the element you react with for 15 to 20 seconds. No other artifact set comes close to this for her, and she doesn't even need to build crit like a DPS would, so with the time until her banner you have no excuse. I do want to point out however that there are some issues with using the scroll set on her. For one, only one character can use this set on a team, and this set is very important to her buffing profile. So if later on we get new Natlan units that want to use this set, like the Pyro Orcon for example, if she's a support, it may just be very awkward to fit her into your teams. Also, if you have two different damaging elements in your team, so in certain Vape or Melt teams, getting the scroll buff on both of the elements can be very awkward as well. And this matters less if your other damage dealer isn't as invested as your main carry, so potentially it isn't a big deal, but just something to take into consideration. Now for main stats, she doesn't do a lot of damage as a support, so it isn't really worth trying to build damage on her. I would try to maximize her healing instead, so use a defense or ER Sands, defense goblet and healing bonus or defense circlet, or a crit rate circlet if you're using Favonius. If you plan to get her Constellation 4, spoiler warning, she will have a buff that scales off of her defense, in which case I would always run a defense circlet. And for substats, prioritize ER and defense as well as crit rate if you're using Favonius. Now as a main DPS, here's an artifact sheet for starters, and again there's really a clear choice for a set being Obsidian Codex, due to the massive amount of crit rate it provides. But Husk and Marusha can suffice while you get a decent set going for it. For main stats, you always want to defend Sands. A geo damage goblet is ideal, but a defense goblet is only about 5% behind, so it can be used as well. And lastly, you want a crit circlet, whatever gives you a better ratio, in which case it's most likely going to be crit damage because of how much crit rate Obsidian gives. Here's the substat priority. Now let's move on to her weapons. As a support, Xilonen has 3 main weapon options I think are worth talking about. The first obviously being Favonius. This weapon alone allows Xilonen to meet her energy requirements on basically all of her teams, as well as lowering the rest of your team's energy needs. If you are going to use this weapon, note that again, Xilonen doesn't really need to stack defense at all, unless you're going for her C4, so just focus on building as much crit rate as possible and use a crit rate circlet. Next up we have the Flute of Epstein. You basically only use this weapon if you don't have a spare Favonius, as almost every sword character under the sun wants that weapon. This weapon also gives you so much defense to where you can just prioritize building energy recharge. And lastly we have her signature, the Peak Patrol Song, which is amazing as it gives a team-wide 26% damage bonus. I know it's technically 25.6, but I'm not saying that each time, so now it's 26%. You need 3200 defense to max this buff out. Thankfully, between the fact that Xilonen has a defense ascension and this weapon gives over 100% defense, it's actually very easily achievable even with 1 defense main stat. I would recommend using an ER Sands as well, and this weapon is just a 10% damage increase to any party members that get the buff. Very good supportive weapon overall. And with the weapon banner changes, I think it's really worth going for it. Now moving on to our DPS weapons, again here's the weapon sheet so you get the general gist of things. As I always say, anything not on the list isn't worth considering, as it means that the free craftable you get is going to be a better weapon option. Now to talk about some of her weapon options in more detail, Xilonen scaling purely off of defense is really awkward for her, as there are barely any swords that support that, on top of the fact that most of her damage is from plunging, so even less weapons can support that. Peak Patrol Song still ends up being her best weapon option, giving 46% damage bonus and a boatload of defense, and Harbinger of Dawn can perform really well with high passive uptime, but in practice this may be more inconsistent due to the fact that you won't always be above 90% HP, even with Shunyun's healing, so in that case you might just keep using the Flute for more consistency. The Flute of Epstein, not the actual flute. And that's about it really. I don't think any other weapons need to be explained, it's pretty straightforward, and now let's talk about her teams. Xilonen is one of the most flexible characters in the game due to the buff she provides for the elemental damage dealers, so she can pretty easily just slot in anywhere you could use Kazuha, and you'll find great success with her. And there are also a lot of teams where you can just use her with Kazuha to double down on the buffs they provide, and at C0 that is close to an 80% damage bonus and a 76% resistance shred. And this really shines on teams where the damage dealer isn't reaction reliant, so for example Neuvillette teams. With Furina, Kazuha and the Ocelot, this should theoretically be his new best team, replacing Zhongli for a stronger damage bonus and resistance shred. You do lose out on Zhongli's shield, so you will have to space attacks better so you don't get hit, but assuming you do so, this is a noticeable upgrade to his teams, and you know, Neuvillette being the weakest damage dealer in the game definitely needed this. Another team that could utilize this core are Mono Pyro teams. A lot of people were upset that the buffs to Mono Pyro came in the form of off-field damage dealers like Emily who don't buff at all, but this changes with Xilonen still giving you the benefit of short rotation times, while amplifying your on-field carry's damage. Overall, you do get buffed enough to where you can offset things like Emily's damage, and depending on the investment of your pyro carry, this can be an upgrade to those teams, especially in AoE as Emily is mostly single target. Also keep in mind, these 3 and any attack skiller should be quite solid, and even though I don't think it will be as good as Mono Pyro or Neuvillette, you can try running Mono Hydra with other Hydra DPS like Yulan, Mulan, or Kokomi, or Ayato. You were typically running Seedrine here before, who isn't that great, so this should just be a better way to navigate these teams. On the topic of Hydro teams, separating from Kazuha and instead trying to replace him, she can slot into the Vaporized core very nicely. You are going to shred both Hydro and Pyro resistances by default. However, as stated prior, you want to generate your Pyro crystal at the start of your rotation and then carry on with it as normal. The scroll set buff does only get applied to your Pyro character, which does seem like a massive downside compared to the Viridescent double sword rotations, but your Hydro unit contributes less than like 20% of the team's damage. It won't be that big of a deal. The only reason my double swirling was so big for Onoma units is just because the buffs don't last as long, which isn't the same case for Xilonen. The exact same thing applies to double Pyro melt teams, which is the team you just really couldn't use Kazuha on because of the low buff uptime, but with Xilonen this team is a lot more realized for a character like Risley. Again, you want to get a cryo crystallize at the start of your rotation for the scroll buff, and then carry on like normal. You can also double stack Kazuha's buffs for your cryo on-fielder from one of cryo teams with Xilonen. It is something you can do, but generally worse than the melt teams. Next, Umbrella Warfare, I guess. That was a good impression, right? Navia gets a new best teammate in Xilonen. For a while, Navia didn't really have another wholly synergistic Geo unit, having to use a one construct Chiori, or other Geo units who just didn't do a whole lot for her. But in Natlin, we first had Kachina, who was able to hold the scroll set on her teams, and now Xilonen can do that but better, boosting Navia teams by quite a bit. And the last slot in your team can either be Furina or Shangling. You do run into some issues with getting all her stacks sometimes, as Xilonen applies no off-field Geo for Crystallize, but her buffs more than outweigh this issue, so it doesn't really become that big of a deal at all, and it's still an upgrade even accounting for this. Speaking of teams that weren't completely synergistic, we have certain double Hydra teams. Hu Tao wasn't able to get buffed at all in these teams really if you're using Furina, besides Shen Yun, but now that changes with the DJ girl able to provide a rest shred for Hu Tao. I personally think it's worse than Plunge Tao if you're at C0, but if you have C1 or just don't really like the Plunge playstyle, it'll be the best way to play Hu Tao double Hydra teams. Same case with Raiden, she did get Viridescent in these teams from using an Onoma unit, but now she gets that alongside a damage buff, improving this team even more. Lastly, Noelle also has a lot of double Hydra teams, some of which use Kaza to further buff the Hydra units, which she couldn't benefit from, but that's no longer the case, as Xilonen is able to buff her as well. Great buffs all around to double Hydro. Now back to solo Hydro teams, Muulani also gets a new great teammate for her vape teams. The Ocelot just comfortably slots in as a flex slot on Muulani's team cores for a multitude of different variations. And the fact that she applies no off-field Geo is a great benefit here. As a support, I think this is the extent to where she'll feel the best in. This is of course not all her teams. I haven't mentioned things like Aggravate or Electrocharge, which will be able to work in too, and probably some other units that aren't coming to my head right now. But if you were to ask me where and who Xilonen benefits the most, it would be all the teams I listed above. And now we can finally talk about her DPS teams. Xilonen's plunges are her only scaling worthwhile to talk about, as her normal attacks are pretty lackluster, so for this team to feel good you're really going to want to have Shen Yun, otherwise I can't really recommend it. And from there you'll use Furina and your last slot can be Goro. But Kachina is going to be the best here, enabling Xilonen's A4 and being able to hold the scroll set. Xilonen does very solid personal damage on these teams, it's just that no other character is really dealing damage besides her, on top of the fact that the rotation length is on the longer side with a gap between damage windows, leading to the overall team DPS to not be as high. Overall, there are a lot of things in Xilonen's kit that incentivizes her DPS playstyle, like the fact that her Geo samples will stay active for her field time, and the fact that she gets a personal damage increase on teams when not using her supportive kit. Her design is also so good, so I can understand wanting to use her as a main carry, in which case it actually isn't that bad. This is not just a whale thing as well, and is pretty viable with her signature weapon at C0, so if you want to go for it, go ahead. Just know that her supportive playstyle is a better use for her. This is just something you can do if you really want her on field. So let's talk about her constellations now. Xilonen has very good constellations all around that improve both her supportive and DPS playstyle. Her C1 is unfortunately not one of those constellations. It of course gives you the typical exploration jargon of decreasing her nice little point consumption and increasing her duration. And lastly, it increases your active character's interruption resistance, but it's not a lot. For reference, it's the same amount Sino and Ayato get, who are characters that still get knocked around to all hell. Interruption resistance does scale quite well when stacked, so for characters that do get base interruption resistance, it will feel a lot better, but overall do not go for this constellation as a standalone. This is just a filler constellation until her C2. And her C2 is insane, giving you very different effects to your on or off-field characters of the corresponding element when her source samples are active. Pyro characters get 45% attack, Hydro characters get 45% HP, Cryo gets 60% crit damage, Geo gets a 50% damage bonus, and Electro units will have their burst's energy cost decreased by 25 energy, and their elemental burst cooldown decreased by 5 seconds. Additionally, your Geo source samples are always active, enabling her Geo resistant shred on any team, including Mono Geo or 3 Geo teams. So she also just becomes Ito's best teammate on these teams at C2. For Electro teams specifically, I can only really see this doing anything for Raiden teams, allowing them to run on much shorter rotations teleportations, enabling teams like Raiko with Furina. And this is interesting to see if it will be an upgrade, not sure how it benefits their traditional teams much however. C3 just increases the impact of her resistance shred, which is only a 5% increase to her supportive capabilities. And ironically enough, her skill is such little damage in her DPS teams, that's the same increase in her DPS teams as well. C4 gives her a flat buff that scales off 65% of her defense, and this can be triggered up to 6 times on basic attacks. For this to be impactful, it requires you to have quite high defense, so assuming 4000 defense, which is possible with her signature weapon and an ER Sans, this is a 7% increase from C3, which is kind of underwhelming, and past here only her DPS playstyle really benefits. Starting with C5, that just increases her burst scaling further, and to close things off, her C6 will enhance her Night Soul Blessing state for 5 seconds, which will increase the damage of her normal and plunge attacks based on 300% of her defense, as well as heal, but that isn't that important as you only get a few ticks of healing and it's only about 4 to 5k. At least it's a team-wide heal, I guess. Assuming half of her attacks in this window get buffed by this, you're looking at a 33% damage increase from C6, which is a big jump. In my opinion, really just stop at C2 or C3, there's no reason to go any further, and that will conclude the guide portion of the video. Overall, Xilonen is one of the best characters we've had in a while, and I think even if you do have a Kazuha, she can be such a worthwhile pickup using them both on the same team or on separate ones, so you can enable strong buffs on both sides of the abyss. There isn't really a type of account I can see go wrong in picking her up, so she has one of my strongest recommendations, and I think it's clear she'll be a top tier character. There are people acting like she's this insane omega power creep character, but that is not really the case. And at C0 without her signature, she's only really a side grade for most characters, best teams, and only a notable upgrade to a few characters like Mualani, Nuvola, and Navia. So don't expect her to drastically alter the balance of your account, she's just another top tier support in line with how good they all are, and that's why she's a good pickup. So with that, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on Xilonen, as I'd love to hear it and respond to almost every single comment. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.